Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Griffin Locke, and for this winter, home is a makeshift metal box bolted high on a launch tower overlooking the frozen expanse of Lake Superior. This steel skeleton was originally built to hold orbital rockets upright while they waited for a clear shot at the sky. Now, instead of sensitive aerospace hardware, it holds my family and one guy from my old crew through a brutal season that doesn't give a damn about launch schedules. The shelter isn't pretty to look at. It is a rough square of salvaged steel panels wrapped tightly around one of the upper maintenance platforms. It is a closed shell with a heavy hatch cut into the floor and just enough square footage for 4 narrow bunks, a wood-fired barrel stove, and shelves stacked with the scavenged supplies that keep us alive. When the wind comes off the lake, it hammers the walls and the whole structure shivers and groans under our feet, but the bolts are torqued tight and the welds have held so far. From the narrow viewing slit cut into the north wall, I can see the jagged, frozen edge of the lake and the dark, silent shapes of the launch complex spread out along the shore. Concrete pads, fuel storage tanks, empty hangars, and service roads buried under 2 feet of hard-packed snow. Somewhere past that industrial graveyard out of sight sits the town we fled when the infection turned crowded streets into open feeding grounds. Inside the box, the air is thick. It smells like wood smoke, warm metal, and unwashed people who have been living too close for too long. My wife, Elise, and our 7-year-old daughter, Tessa, are asleep in the bunks bolted along the interior wall. Elliot Crane, who used to wear the same company patch I did, is sitting on late watch by the hatch with a wool blanket over his shoulders and a dead radio at his feet. We survived the first half of winter without freezing, starving, or getting pitched off this tower. That didn't happen by luck. It happened because I knew this structure better than I knew most of my neighbors, and because when the world fell apart last fall, I made a choice. While everyone else ran for distance, I chose height. Before the world went sideways, my life was simple enough to explain in one sentence. I kept a launch tower on the south shore of Lake Superior, standing straight and ready every time a client wanted to light a rocket under it. My company badge formally identified me as an infrastructure technician level 3, but most days I was just a mechanic with a heavy toolbox and a hell of a view. We called it the Superior Launch Complex, a sprawling grid of poured concrete pads, fuel storage tanks, corrugated hangars, and one massive orbital tower that stuck up over the pine trees like a steel needle. It was a bleak industrial place, especially in the off-season. On rough days, the wind rolled off the lake hard enough to make the heavy cross braces hum a low note, pushing snow sideways across the lot until the asphalt disappeared completely. My routine didn't change much from week to week. I drove in before sunrise in a beat-up white company pickup, let the gate guard scan my badge with a sleepy nod, and parked in the same faded line of trucks near the maintenance shop. Inside the perimeter fence, my world narrowed down to steel legs, service ladders, hydraulic pump housings, breaker panels, and endless clipboards of checklists. If something rusted, cracked, leaked, or shook when it wasn't supposed to, it showed up on my work order sooner or later. Elliot Crane worked most shifts alongside me. He liked to call himself a glorified janitor for rich people's rockets, but that was just his way of deflecting. The guy knew every bolt, brace, and cable run on that tower better than the engineers who designed it. On service days, we rode the industrial elevator up with our tool bags between our feet, the mesh walls rattling as we climbed. Usually, we stepped out halfway and walked the higher levels on foot when the lift reached its top stop. We spent hours tugging on safety rails, checking torque marks on structural bolts, listening for the grinding sound of bad bearings, and watching how the structure moved when the gusts hit it from the lakeside. Home was a small rental about 20 minutes away from the main gate, a warm box against the cold. Elise worked long shifts at a local clinic, and Tessa was in first grade, drawing crooked rockets in crayon and asking when she could see a launch up close instead of watching the live stream on a tablet. It was a normal life, boring in the best way possible. The first news about the infection came and went like any other sensational story that didn't touch our county. It started as background noise, a short TV segment about a fast, nasty flu variant in a big city on the coast, a headline on my phone about patients attacking hospital staff, a shaky cell phone video of someone slamming their body into a hospital security door until the safety glass spiderwebbed while people yelled off camera. The news anchors kept their voices calm, said it was isolated and under control, and told people not to panic. We listened to them because back then we still thought they knew what they were talking about. But in town, things started to shift in small, uncomfortable ways. The grocery shelves looked a little thinner each week, with gaps appearing in the canned goods and water aisles. A few mom-and-pop shops closed temporarily and simply never reopened. People standing in line at the gas station kept more distance than usual, eyeing each other without talking about why. Elise came home from the clinic with a new tightness in her voice, smelling of antiseptic and sweat, and told me they were seeing more patients with high fevers and strange aggressive behavior. Not just confusion, but sudden animal rage. One night she sat at the kitchen table after Tessa went to bed, still wearing her scrubs. She stared at her hands for a long time and finally said, "We had a guy come in today yelling that his skin was burning. 10 minutes later, he tried to bite a chunk out of a nurse's arm. We had to sedate him and lock him in a supply storage room because no one could get a straight answer from upstairs or from the police." I asked her if anyone from public health had called them back to give guidance, and she shook her head and said, "We get automated messages and links to government websites. Nobody is actually picking up the phone anymore." Driving to work the next morning, the unease settled in my gut. I passed a wreck at a rural intersection that didn't make sense. Two sedans sat nose to nose with both driver doors wide open and no one in sight. Farther down the road, a man stood in the ditch without a coat, arms hanging limp at his sides, his head turning slowly like he was listening for something far away. I slowed down and went around him, giving him a wide berth. He didn't look at the truck or react to the engine noise at all. At the complex, the guard at the gate held my badge a few seconds longer than usual, looking past me at the road. He handed it back and said, "You hearing the same stuff I am on the scanner?" When I asked what he meant, he leaned out of the booth and said, "Domestic disputes, fights in the street, people not staying down after they get tased, dispatches telling officers not to touch anybody without full riot gear." My brother is a paramedic in Duluth. He says the ER there looks like a war zone. Operations sent a memo later that day. No visitors, no tours. Non-essential staff were told to work from home effective immediately. For us on the tower crew, there was no remote option. You can't grease a bearing over Zoom. As long as the power grid stayed up, we were told to keep the hardware in launch-ready shape. Elliot tried to laugh it off, but his jokes fell flat. On the tower one bitter afternoon, he tapped a steel beam with his wrench and said, "Whatever is going on out there, at least this pile of metal still complains in the same language." I told him I agreed, but when I looked down at the access road from that height, I counted more parked cars than usual along the shoulder, and more of them sat at strange angles, like they had been abandoned in a hurry. By late fall, the news anchors had dropped the calm tone and started using words like outbreak, containment failure, and exponential spread. Some nights we lost the local stations completely and only got static or emergency broadcast warnings telling people to shelter in place. The line in the sand for me was when calls to regular numbers started failing. I tried to phone Elise on my lunch break, and the call dropped 3 times before it even rang. The clinic switchboard went straight to a recording that said all circuits were busy. When I finally got her on her personal cell that evening, her voice sounded thin and terrified. Her first words were, "We need a plan that is not just go to work and hope someone fixes this." The next morning on the tower, the lake looked darker than I had ever seen it, and the air had that sharp metallic edge it gets right before real winter starts. I stood on the grating, looked at the upper platforms, and for the first time I thought that the safest place I knew might be a long way up in the air instead of down on the street. The day everything finally tipped over started deceivingly cold and clear. A hard frost covered the truck windshield in a lace pattern, and the radio in the maintenance shop played the same recorded emergency bulletin on a loop, while Elliot and I pulled on our work gloves. The automated voice told citizens to stay home, lock their doors, and avoid public gatherings. It notably did not say who, if anyone, was still in charge. Operations gutted the work list that morning. There was no launch prep, no payload integration, only the most basic continuity checks on the tower structure and the backup generators. Half the employee parking lot sat empty, the asphalt showing through the dusting of snow. We rode the elevator up once, walked a short, silent round on the mid-platform, and looked out toward the distant highway. Even from miles away, it looked wrong. More cars than usual sat dead on the shoulder. Some faced the wrong way, headlights pointing into traffic. A box truck leaned half into the median ditch like someone had simply let go of the wheel and never come back. Near the end of the shift, the site manager called us into the main maintenance bay. A handful of techs stood nervously between the red tool chests while he read from a printed sheet that shook slightly in his hand. All launches were suspended indefinitely. Non-essential staff were being sent home immediately. The site would move to skeleton crews strictly for perimeter security and power maintenance. Then he looked up and said, "If you plan to treat this place as a fallback, decide now. Once road controls start, you may not be able to get back in." That line sat heavy in my head all the way into town. The drive normally took 20 minutes. That afternoon, it took almost an hour of stop-and-go crawling. Lines of cars wrapped around the few gas stations that still had power, drivers standing by their pumps and watching the street. One major intersection was blocked by 2 empty sedans and a police truck with its doors wide open. An officer in a tactical mask stood in the middle of the road and waved people around without looking at their faces. Somewhere deeper in the streets, a siren wailed, rising and falling until it cut off abruptly like someone had unplugged it. Elise met me outside our apartment building with Tessa's pink backpack on her shoulder and Tessa gripping her hand tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Tessa wore her winter coat and her cheeks were red from the biting air. Elise looked like she hadn't sat down all day. Her scrubs were rumpled and there was a dark stain near the hem that I hoped was just coffee. She helped Tessa climb into the truck, shut the heavy door, and said, "The clinic is down to bare bones. I walked out 10 minutes ago and nobody even argued with me. They're completely out of beds. Half the people in the hallway aren't sick like the flu. They grab and bite at anything that moves. Security sprayed one guy in front of the kids' corner because he wouldn't stop chewing on the wooden doorframe." Tessa stared at the dashboard and squeezed her backpack straps, her eyes wide and unblinking. We pulled onto the main road and fell into a slow, agonizing crawl heading toward the highway on-ramp. Every few minutes, some panic-stricken driver tried to race up the gravel shoulder, kicking up slush, only to get forced back in when the shoulder filled with stalled cars. A woman 2 cars ahead abandoned her vehicle in the middle of the lane after leaning on her horn for a solid minute. She grabbed a small gym bag from the back seat and walked away toward the side streets without looking back. Elise kept one hand on Tessa's knee and said, "We can't just sit in that apartment and hope no one kicks the door in. We need somewhere that isn't stacked on top of 300 other people." I gripped the wheel and told her, "We try the highway first. If it's moving, we put serious distance between us and this mess. If it's blocked, we turn back to the only place I know how to lock down." The on-ramp looked like a parking lot from hell. State patrol cars blocked part of the merge, their light bars still flashing blue and red against the gray sky, but there was no one behind the wheels. Beyond them, the highway lanes were jammed with cars at odd angles, a city bus smashed against the concrete median with every window broken, and a semi-truck on its side spilling cargo across 3 lanes. Dark shapes moved between the stopped vehicles. Some walked with that stiff, off-balance gait I had already seen in the hospital videos, jerky, purposeless, but relentless. I stopped the truck well short of the ramp. A man 2 cars ahead got out and started shouting questions into the mess. No one answered him. Farther down the line, somebody screamed once, a high, sharp sound, and did not scream again. Elise watched the motion between the cars, her face pale, and said, "If we stay here, we're just sitting in a metal box that can't turn or run. We're trapped if anything sweeps this line." I didn't argue. I put the truck in reverse back down the shoulder under a chorus of angry horn blasts and turned us toward the industrial service road that led back to the launch complex. On that road, the world opened up again. There were fewer houses, more empty snow-covered fields, and the same tall, reassuring outline of the orbital tower rising over the low buildings ahead. Tessa looked from my face to Elise's and finally asked in a small voice, "Are we going to your work now?" I nodded and said, "For now, sweetie. It's high, it's fenced, and I know where they keep the backup heat." A mile from the main gate, I saw a solitary figure walking on the gravel beside the drainage ditch with a heavy pack over one shoulder. As we got closer, I recognized the hunched, determined way he carried himself before I even saw his face. I slowed the truck, rolled the window down a crack, and called out, "Elliot, that you?" He turned toward the truck, lifted a gloved hand to shield his eyes, and said, "Yeah. They sent us home, and I got 10 minutes into town before I decided I liked the tower more than my neighbors right now." I stopped beside him and said, "Get in if you're serious, we're heading back." He glanced at Elise and Tessa through the glass, hesitated for half a breath, and then opened the rear door and slid in next to Tessa, keeping his pack on his lap like a shield. He slammed the door and said, "If they close that gate for good, I'd rather be inside it than on the wrong side of the fence." At the complex entrance, the guard stepped out of his booth with his jacket zipped to his chin and his handheld radio hissing low with static. He took in the truck, the family in the front, Elliot in the back, and the brake lights stacked out on the distant highway like a river of red. He didn't ask for ID. He opened the gate, waved us through, and said, "If you're planning to ride this out here, park near the maintenance bay. You won't be the only one sleeping on site tonight." We parked the truck by the heavy roll-up doors of the maintenance bay, just like the guard told us, and shut the engine off. The silence that followed was heavy. For a few seconds, none of us moved to open a door. The same industrial buildings I saw every day sat right in front of us, but with half the security lights off and absolutely no traffic moving between them, they already looked like they were closing for good. Elise watched the empty snow-dusted lot, rubbed her hands together once to chase away a chill that wasn't just from the air, and said, "If this place falls apart too, Griffin, we are officially out of plans." I looked at her and told her, "Then we make sure this one lasts longer than the others." Inside the cavernous bay, people had already started turning the workspace into a makeshift bunk room. Wool blankets lay spread out between rolling tool carts. 2 technicians shared a steaming thermos on a greasy workbench, speaking in hushed tones. A security guard, still in uniform but without his cap, unrolled a sleeping bag beside a stack of winter tires. The site manager stood near the central whiteboard with a thick folder in his hand, looking like a captain whose ship was slowly sinking. He walked over when he saw Elise and Tessa standing behind me and said, "You brought your family in. Good." I answered, "Home looks worse than the drive. The highway is a parking lot of dead cars. Out here, at least I know what I am standing on." He nodded once tiredly and said, "Grid is still live and the main tanks are full. We have diesel for weeks if we ration strictly. Water pressure is fine. Food is not. Until that changes, this place is an island for us." He pointed at the large corkboard by the door. Someone had pinned a simple hand-drawn map of the complex there. Strips of colored tape marked sleeping areas in the bay, 2 small offices converted for medical use, and storerooms that now held whatever food they could scrape together from the vending machines and cafeteria. Thin marker lines showed patrol loops along the perimeter fence. In one corner, the orbital launch tower sat by itself, just a rough outline with the word "later" scrawled under it in red ink. We claimed a narrow strip of concrete floor by a side wall. Elise spread out our blankets and sat Tessa down with a coloring book and crayons from her backpack, trying to create a bubble of normalcy. Elliot dropped his heavy pack by a mechanic's toolbox, glanced at the map again, and said quietly, "You see how the tower is off by itself?" I said, Yeah, because it doesn't sleep anyone or feed anyone yet. He shook his head, looked me in the eye and said, no, because nobody else wants to think about living 60 feet up in the wind. When the bay finally settled into a restless, echoing quiet, I stepped outside. The air coming off the lake had that damp, penetrating cold that slides through every layer of clothing when you stand still. A thin, fresh layer of snow traced the cracks in the concrete apron. The tower rose ahead of me, a massive tripod of steel legs bolted into the pad with cross braces and grated platforms climbing up into the dark. I walked to the base and rode the service elevator up alone. At a mid-level, I stepped out and walked onto the open platform with a gloved hand on the freezing rail. From there, I could see the smear of town lights fading in the distance, the stuck red line of taillights on the highway, and the dark, silent blocks of the complex below. Above me, 2 full decks sat between that mid-level and the upper service arms. Each was big enough to hold a small room and still leave a narrow walkway around the edges. I knew the specs by heart, how much weight they could carry per square foot and exactly how the tower moved when the wind hit it from the lakeside. If we kept any structure light and tied it directly into the main legs, it would hold. If noise on the ground started drawing the infected toward our fence, height would be the one thing they couldn't rush. It was a natural filter. By the time I rode the elevator back down, the idea wasn't just a maybe anymore. It was the only option that made sense. If the bay turned bad, if sickness got in or people panicked, we needed a door they couldn't kick down. If the perimeter fence failed, we needed distance and clear sight lines. The safest place I knew wasn't on the floor with everyone else. It was on steel, halfway to the sky. In the morning, I spread a blank sheet of paper on a clean workbench, called Elise and Elliot over, and drew a simple outline of the tower with a box situated on one of the upper decks. Tessa sat on a blanket nearby with a spoon and a cold can of peaches, pretending not to listen. I tapped the box with my pencil and said, "We have a short window before real winter hits. While the grid is up and the elevator works, we build a closed room right here. Then we move food, water, fuel, and blankets into it. If this bay turns bad, we go up and shut a hatch instead of a hallway door." Elise looked at the sketch, her brow furrowed, and asked, "How sure are you that thing stays up when the first heavy storm comes in off the lake?" "It's not a house, Griffin," I told her. "It is built to hold a fully loaded rocket and its fuel lines in winds that tear shingles off houses. We keep what we add: light, panels, and insulation, and bolt it straight into the main legs," Elliot added. "And anything on 2 legs that wants trouble has to climb a ladder for it in the cold. Most people won't make it past the first landing." The site manager drifted over and watched us. He pointed at my drawing and said, "Is that a real plan or just you calming yourself down with engineering?" I looked him in the face and said, "Real plan. Elliot and I know that steel better than we know most streets in town. If this runs longer than a few days, we need somewhere that doesn't share walls or air with anyone we didn't pick ourselves." He looked at Tessa eating her peaches, then at Elise, then at the map on the wall, and finally said, "I don't have orders from corporate anymore. If you can build it without wrecking my tower, I'm not going to be the one who stops you. Just leave one path up that I can climb if things down here stop working." After that, there was no point calling it an idea. It was work. Work started the next morning before the cheap coffee in the break room even finished dripping. Elliot and I went through the maintenance inventory like looters, pulling anything that could turn an open steel platform into a closed, livable room. Spare galvanized steel panels, square tubing, heavy angle stock, buckets of high-grade bolts, and boxes of self-tapping screws. Some items were tagged with bright orange stickers for future capital projects that were definitely not going to happen now, so I stripped the tags off and left them in a pile on the counter. When the manager raised an eyebrow at the growing mound of hardware, I said, "If we ever get back to those jobs, I will personally cut you new pieces." He nodded once, picked up his coffee, and went back to monitoring the silent radio channels. Before we carried a single piece of metal up, we climbed to the chosen deck and checked every bolt on the existing grating and cross braces. Anything loose got tightened until the torque wrench clicked. Anything rusty got scraped down to bare metal and sprayed with cold galvanizing compound. We marked the outer edge of the platform with bright yellow hazard tape so nobody stepped too close to the 60-foot drop while tired or carrying weight. The plan stayed simple on purpose. Complexity breaks things. We would use the platform as a solid base, build a light steel frame on top, skin it in panels, and keep everything centered over the main structural legs so the load went straight down into the concrete pad. Inside, we would make room for 4 sleeping spots, a barrel stove, shelves for supplies, and a narrow strip of floor to stand in without hitting our heads. As long as the grid held and the motors hummed, the service elevator was our best tool. We loaded the raw steel into the back of the pickup, drove to the base of the tower, and stacked panels and tube inside the elevator cab until we hit the weight limit alarm. One of us rode up with each load while the other stayed below to prep the next batch. On the deck, we slid the pieces out, leaned them against the inner rail, and tied them off with ratchet straps so a sudden gust from the lake couldn't throw them around like playing cards. Elise asked where she and Tessa fit into all this construction. I told her, "While we are building, you two stay down here or in the control building with the doors locked and the handheld radios on. Once we have 4 walls and a roof, I bring you up and we finish the inside together." She didn't like the thought of listening from below while we worked high up in the wind, but she understood the math. A 7-year-old on an open steel deck during construction was not an option. We did the cutting and drilling on the ground whenever we could to save time. A mobile chop saw and a cordless drill lived on the concrete apron beside the maintenance bay. We measured with a fat permanent marker, laid each wall frame out on the flat concrete, cut the tubes to length, and pre-drilled the joints. The bottom and top rectangles came first, followed by the uprights spaced exactly to match the width of the panels. No wall frame was small enough for one person to carry safely in the elevator, so we broke each section into halves. A half frame was light enough for one of us to wrestle into the lift and onto the platform. Once 2 halves were up, we bolted them together at the seam and tied them directly into the tower legs with heavy-duty brackets and grade 8 bolts. The first time we stood a frame up on the platform, the project stopped being a drawing and became real. The deck that had always been open space now had a hard vertical line where a wall would stand. Elliot pressed his gloved hand against the cold steel, felt how it sat against the wind, and said, "Once we get all 4 up and tied in, this place is going to feel smaller and safer at the same time." I checked the level one last time and told him he was right. We worked in layers, frame around the perimeter first, cross pieces at mid-height and near the top for stiffness, then panels on the outside, running screws through pre-drilled holes so we didn't have to fight the metal with cold fingers. The sound of the impact driver echoed off the empty fuel tanks below, a sharp rat-tat-tat that I hoped didn't carry too far. Each panel we hung cut down the wind a little more and made the deck feel less like scaffolding and more like the outline of a room. By the end of the first full day on the tower, one wall and half of another stood at full height, skinned on the outside and open on the inside. Snow blew through the exposed side and collected in drifts along the bare grating. When I finally climbed down the last ladder, my hands shook uncontrollably from the cold and the strain of holding steel in the wind. Elise met me at the bay door, took one look at my pale face and said, "You are not going back up there tonight." She set a mug of instant soup in my hand before I could argue, and honestly, I didn't have the energy to try. On the second hard day on the platform, the cold bit harder. We set the last wall frame, tied it into the legs, and finished hanging the panels around the perimeter. For the first time, we could stand inside a defined shape and feel the wind rushing above us and below us, but not directly on our faces. The roof came next. We built it as a shallow pitch, high on the lakeside and low on the inland side, so snow would slide off instead of piling up and crushing us. Angled tube tied into the upper frame, then panels were laid across and fastened down with rubber washer screws to seal out the melt. The hatch in the floor was the one piece I refused to rush. We marked a square over the point where the access ladder rose from the level below. Cutting the heavy floor grating took 3 cutting wheels on the grinder and a lot of patience. We framed the opening with heavier angle stock to keep it rigid. The hatch itself was a reinforced panel on heavy steel hinges with a drop bar on the inside. When closed, the bar dropped into welded brackets, so the weight of anyone standing on it drove it harder into the stops. When we finally dropped the hatch in place and swung it shut from above, there was a solid, resonant thud that I felt through the soles of my boots. Elliot knocked on it with his knuckles and said, "If someone ever comes up that ladder who shouldn't, they are going to have a very bad day." I told him, "The point is that we hear them on the ladder long before they ever touch the hatch." Vent openings and the stove cutout finished the basic structure. One wall got a square opening high up with a simple sheet metal hood to keep snow and rain out while letting air cycle. Another got a circular cut near the floor where the barrel stovepipe would eventually go. We sealed the gaps around the pipe sleeve with high-temperature silicone so smoke couldn't creep back in. By the end of the last clear week before the forecast turned worse, the box had 4 solid walls, a pitched roof, a working security hatch, and enough fasteners in it that neither of us worried about a normal storm peeling it off the platform. It was empty, echoing and cold inside, just bare metal on every side. But it was a room off the ground, and that was a hell of a lot more than we had when we started. With the steel shell finished, we had to make it livable before the weather turned from merely cold to genuinely dangerous. The last working computer terminal in the maintenance office showed a week of plummeting temperatures and a heavy snow system rolling off the lake like a bruised wall. I looked at the wind arrows stacked over our side of Superior and told Elliot, "We have days, not weeks. Whatever is going up there for the winter goes now." We made a master list on a grease-stained clipboard. Heat, light, food, water, bedding, tools, and a way to move it all without breaking our backs or burning out the elevator motor. Heat came first. The site had plenty of electric space heaters, but they sucked power like crazy, and I didn't trust the grid to last another week. We needed a simple dumb stove we could feed with almost anything that burned. Behind the maintenance shop, buried under a drift, we found a clean 55-gallon steel drum that had once held hydraulic oil. It was dry inside. We dragged it into the bay, fired up the MIG welder, and went to work. We cut a rectangular door in the side, welded on short, sturdy legs from scrap angle iron, and added a flange for the pipe on the top. A length of galvanized stovepipe with a rain cap finished the stack. When we test burned some scrap pine in it inside the bay, the barrel stove drew hard, roaring like a jet engine and heating the concrete floor faster than any electric heater we owned. We let it cool down, then wrestled it to the base of the tower. 2 of us could handle the barrel, but it was awkward. The pipe and fittings rode beside it in the elevator. On the deck, we set the stove on a thick steel plate so we didn't cook the grating or melt our boots. Ran the pipe through the wall cutout, attached the cap outside, and sealed the gaps with high-temperature red silicone. Next came fuel. There was no tree line inside the security fence, but there was more burnable material in an industrial park than most people saw. Shipping pallets, broken crate parts, old wooden shelving, and particle board office furniture from empty rooms all turned into firewood. We stacked it on the apron, cut the longest pieces down to stove length with the chop saw, and loaded them by the armful into the elevator until a good corner of the deck held neat, tight rows of cut wood. Elise handled the food and bedding logistics while we worked the tower. With Tessa glued to her side, she went through the break room storerooms and tagged anything that could sit through a freeze-thaw cycle without spoiling. Rice, dried beans, canned vegetables, powdered milk, oats, salt, sugar. She made piles by type, left a fair share in the bay for the others, and packed the rest into sealed plastic tubs. We carried those tubs to the tower base, stacked them in the elevator, and raised them to the deck in batches, treating them like gold bricks. Water came in blue 50-gallon drums from maintenance and clear 5-gallon jugs from the office coolers. The complex still had tap pressure, but nobody knew for how long. We filled every container we could find, capped them tight, and moved them to the tower. On the deck, we lined the heaviest drums against the inner walls. They served two purposes: drinking water and ballast to dampen the vibration of the tower. Power was the next problem to solve. The main feed still hummed, but the dead spots in town told me not to trust that sound. In a side bay, we found a pallet of portable diesel generators, still shrink-wrapped from a canceled field project. We cut one free, checked the oil, and test-fired it outside. It started on the second pull and settled into a steady, rhythmic note. That unit and 2 red jerry cans of diesel went up in the elevator, then got strapped to the wall opposite the stove with the exhaust run through its own small metal sleeve to the outside. We didn't plan to run it full-time. A few hours of generator usage each day would charge our battery bank, spin a small circulation fan, and maybe power a compact ceramic heater when the cold cut deepest. The rest of the time we would live on stored charge, LED lanterns, and the heat from the stove. Inside the box, we started making it look more like a home and less like a shipping container. 4 narrow bunks bolted to 2 walls, stacked one above another, left a narrow strip in the center for standing. Thin mattresses and sleeping bags scavenged from the bay lay on top. We screwed hooks along the walls for coats and packs. A small folding table under one slit window would hold the radio, a notebook, and whatever map we were keeping updated. By the time we finished mounting the bunks, Tessa had worn a path in the bay floor with her nervous pacing. Elise put her hand on my arm and said, "If it's safe enough now, we should see it. She needs to know this is real before the wind really starts." I checked the sky, glanced at the forecast one more time, and said, "Okay, we take one slow trip. No loose gear, no rushing on the ladder." We rode the elevator together for the first time since the build started. The cage rattled as it climbed. Tessa stood between us with both hands gripping the rail, eyes wide as the ground dropped away and the cars below turned into toys. When the doors opened onto the deck, I stepped out first, checked the wind, and then waved them forward. The box sat on the steel exactly the way I had drawn it, but taller and more solid under my hand when I touched the wall. Inside it was plain, tight, and functional. Bare metal walls, bunks, the black barrel stove, blue drums, and shelves. Tessa walked the length of it in 6 small steps, turned, and said, "It's smaller than the old place." I knelt down and told her, "It is, but it's ours, and nothing down there can walk in without us hearing it first." Elise ran her hand along the lower bunk frame and said, "As long as it stays warm and dry, I don't care how it looks." We didn't sleep up there that first night. I wanted one more day to move the last supplies and set our emergency routines. But when we rode the elevator back down and stepped into the bay, the concrete felt colder and the air felt closer and more stale than it had before. The next evening, with food on the shelves, water drums lined up like soldiers, and fuel stacked high against the wall, we carried our blankets and bags up the lift and shut the heavy hatch above our heads for the first time as more than just a test. Elise shifted her weight on the bunk directly above me, the steel frame groaning softly, and said, "It feels like we're on a ship in rough water." I lay on my back, staring at the underside of her mattress, and told her, "That's how it has always felt up here in a bad wind. Steel has to flex, it bends and comes back. If it ever stops bending and just vibrates, that's when we worry." Tessa was quiet for a long time from the middle bunk. Then she said in a voice too flat for a 7-year-old, "If it falls on the bad people first." The way she said it, without any question in her tone, told me exactly how much she had seen in town before we got out. The first real storm of the season hit us hard 2 nights later. The weather radar in the office had showed the band curling across the lake all day, a massive purple bruise on the screen. By late afternoon, the sky to the northwest was a solid, impenetrable wall of slate gray. The snow started as small, dry grains that hissed as they bounced on the metal deck, then quickly turned into thick, heavy flakes that stuck to everything they touched. The wind picked up in steps, steady at first and then gusting hard enough that the tower's usual metallic creaks turned into longer, lower groans that vibrated through our boots. We went through our storm checks early while we still had daylight. Wood was stacked close to the stove to dry out. Water jugs were moved away from the walls so they wouldn't freeze solid. Flashlights and headlamps were laid out on the table. We checked the generator fuel levels and made sure the cans were within reach without digging. The radio battery was topped off. I checked the hatch bar 3 times myself. Elliot looked over the checklist on the clipboard and said, "If anything fails tonight, it won't be because we were lazy," and I had to agree with him. By dark, the storm had completely wrapped the complex. When I slid the viewing slit open for a quick look, all I saw was white moving past at a 45-degree angle and a few faint orange smudges where the sodium yard lights fought a losing battle through the snow. The sound was constant, an abrasive rush against the exterior panels and a deeper, mournful tone resonating from the main legs. The box moved the way I knew it would, a slow, sickening roll to one side, a pause at the apex, and then a roll back to center. We kept the barrel stove running hotter than usual that night. The draft pulled incredibly well with the high wind, sucking air through the vents, and the bare metal inside the room held a little more warmth each hour the fire stayed up. Even so, the corners of the room stayed bitter cold, and every time someone got up to use the bucket or check the hatch, their breath bloomed white in the beam of a headlamp. Somewhere after midnight, a gust hit us harder than the others, slamming into the flat side of our box like a giant fist. The tower leaned far enough that my stomach did the exact same flip it does at the top of a roller coaster drop. A heavy cross brace somewhere below us gave a single sharp pop like a gunshot as ice shifted on the joint. Tessa's bunk frame squeaked violently and she whispered, terrified, "Is that normal, Daddy?" I forced my voice to stay steady and said, "For a storm like this, yes. If something serious lets go, we are going to hear more than one noise and feel more than one jump." She pulled her blanket tighter around her head and didn't say anything else, but I could hear her breathing fast. We didn't sleep much that first storm night. Sleep came in short, jagged pieces between checks. Every hour, one of us put a hand on the stove to check the fire, another hand on the wall to feel the vibration, and counted slowly while we gauged how the heat held and how the steel moved. Around dawn, the wind finally eased from a terrifying roar to something closer to a steady push, and the snow driving against the slit slowed from a blurred sheet to individual flakes we could actually see. When I finally opened the hatch and climbed down to the next platform, the first thing I noticed was the ice. It coated every single upward-facing surface in a rough white layer. The railings had grown fat and slick. The cross braces had developed sharp ridges. I chipped a bit away with a gloved knuckle and watched the shard fall silently to the level below. Elliot joined me on the grating, his breath steaming, and said, "If it does this every time it blows, we are going to be knocking ice off this thing all winter." He was right. Ice meant weight. And weight in the wrong place was the one thing this tower couldn't handle forever. We worked our way down to the concrete pad slowly, hitting the worst buildup with short lengths of pipe to shatter it, staying clipped into the safety lines whenever we stepped near an edge. On the ground, the yard was a different shape than it had been before the storm. Drifts had swallowed half the height of the truck tires. The path to the maintenance bay was a waist-high channel we had to wade through. The perimeter fence line was just a low, uneven lump under the snow. The others who had stayed in the maintenance bay came out in small groups once the wind eased. One of the security guards stomped his boots by the door, knocking off clumps of snow, and said, "Power flickered twice last night. If that main line from town goes, we're down to whatever those diesel tanks behind the shop can give us." The site manager, looking tired and gray, answered, "Then we use less and stretch it. We don't have a resupply truck coming." For us on the tower, the storm was a test we had passed, but it wrote new jobs on the list. We added detailed ice checks to the morning routine. After every heavy blow, we walked the legs, looked for new stress marks in the paint or metal, and listened for anything that didn't fit the usual symphony of sounds. Inside, we watched how much fuel the stove ate on the worst nights, and calculated how often we could afford to run the generator for extra heat without burning through our reserves. The cold settled in for real after that. Daytime highs stayed stubbornly below freezing. Nights dropped well past zero. The box never fully warmed on its own. Warm became a relative term. Warm meant fingers that could still bend to tie a knot and a nose that didn't sting when you pulled the blanket down to speak. We timed our chores around the burn cycles. When the fire was low, we stayed in the bunks and read or talked quietly to conserve energy. When the stove was running strong, we used that window to move, to check gear, to cook, and to stretch our stiff limbs. Trips outside the box turned more serious. The ladder down to the next level grew slick with rime ice even when we knocked the frost off the rungs. The elevator controls felt sluggish on the coldest mornings, the hydraulic fluid thick as molasses, and every ride came with a nagging thought in the back of my head about what we would do if it quit halfway up. We kept a heavy haul rope coiled by the hatch and a small pulley anchored to the outer frame, a manual backup for moving smaller loads if we ever had to leave the lift alone. From the platform, the fresh snow made everything look clean and peaceful, but the dead town and the frozen lake were still there under it, and the tower only kept us safe if we did our work right every single day. Food and fuel were the only reasons to go back to ground level once winter settled in for real. Everything else we needed was either already inside the box or could wait until spring. Even with strict rationing, the stack of cut wood on the deck shrank faster than I liked, and the numbers in the food inventory notebook dropped every single time I opened it to make a mark. From the narrow viewing slit, we spent hours watching the few buildings that still mattered: the maintenance shop, the fenced fuel yard, the massive central warehouse, and the control block. Beyond the perimeter fence, faint wind-blown tracks marked the county road leading toward town. Some days absolutely nothing moved in the white landscape. Other days a slow, dark shape crossed our field of view and vanished into the pine trees. The infected didn't freeze solid like we hoped they would. They moved slower, their limbs stiff and jerky, and sometimes they stood perfectly still for hours like statues in the snow. But any sharp sound or quick motion woke them up and pulled them toward it with terrifying focus. We watched them stumble between the buildings and built our supply trips around the quiet gaps in their movement. The drop rules stayed simple and non-negotiable. Nobody went down alone. Nobody ran unless something was already reaching for them. Noise stayed at absolute zero. Metal latches got padded with rags. If something could be pushed on a sled instead of dragged, we pushed it. Most runs were routine, terrifying bursts of work. We moved fast, wood from the shop, diesel pumped from the main tanks into jerry cans, boxes of supplies from the warehouse, blankets and copper wiring from the control rooms. Elise hated leaving the safety of the tower, but she took her share of the shifts without complaint. Tessa stayed in the box with whoever was not on the ground, wrapped in a cocoon of blankets with a book and the radio turned low, waiting for the hatch to open again. The first real scare came on a routine wood run. The sky was flat gray, the wind was light, and only two shambling figures moved near the far fence line, well away from us. Elliot and I took the elevator down with empty plastic sleds. At the base, we checked the yard, saw nothing close, and walked quickly to the maintenance shop. Inside, we closed the heavy door and went to work cutting broken shipping pallets down to stove length. After 20 minutes, the sleds were piled high with dry wood. I was rubbing my hands to get the feeling back when a dull, heavy thump came from the back wall of the shop. Elliot killed the saw instantly. We stood there, frozen, listening. Something heavy dragged along the corrugated sheet metal outside. It sounded more like a body leaning and sliding than a knock. The sound moved past the door, scraped along the far corner of the building, and then faded into the wind. We waited until we heard nothing but our own shallow breathing. Elliot leaned close to my ear and whispered, "We go out slow. Sleds behind us. If it is right there, we drop everything and head for the lift. No heroics." I looked at him and answered, "Agreed." When we cracked the door open, the yard was empty. A single set of dragging tracks crossed the fresh snow and ran toward the fuel tanks. We walked back to the tower with the sled sliding silently behind us and didn't say a word until the elevator doors shut and the motor started to whine. Warehouse runs were worse. The building was massive, the aisles were long and shadowed, and every tiny sound bounced off the metal ceiling. We made those trips less often and brought back as much as we could physically carry. Canned food, heavy plastic sheeting, duct tape, batteries. On one run, Elise came with me instead of Elliot. We desperately needed more food and plastic to cover the leaking seams inside the box. Inside the warehouse, she moved down the aisles, pulling what we had on the list with efficient, shaky hands. On the way out, a can of beans slipped from the top of her stack, hit the concrete floor, and rolled in a wide circle before settling. The sound was small, a metallic clink-roll-clink, but in that empty, silent space it sounded like a gunshot. We froze instantly. A few seconds later came an answer from deeper in the rows, soft, shuffling steps and a body bumping against metal shelving. Elise whispered, terrified, "We are not alone." I grabbed her arm and said, "Then we do not wait for it to find us." We tightened our grip on the crates and speed-walked for the loading dock door. At the far end of the next aisle, a figure turned toward the motion, its face slack and pale. By the time it cleared the corner and let out a low hiss, we were outside with the heavy steel door pulled shut and a piece of iron pipe jammed through the handle. The worst day outside the box was when Elliot fell. We had gone to the fuel yard to top off the generator cans before a storm. On the way back, burdened with 40 pounds of diesel each, his boot hit a glazed patch of ice where the sun had hardened the top of a drift. His feet shot out from under him and he landed hard on one leg with a sickening crack that I felt through the snow. He tried to stand up immediately. The leg held his weight for a split second and then folded sideways, his face drained of all color. I set the cans down, got under his arm and hauled him up. He gritted his teeth to keep from screaming. Each step back toward the tower was a torture of shuffling and dragging that scraped more noise out of the yard than I liked. We didn't shout for help. Panic creates noise. At the elevator, I hit the call button and watched the fence line with sweat freezing on my back while we waited for the cage to descend. No shapes moved in the nearest gaps, but the wait felt like hours. When the doors finally opened, we got him inside and rode up in silence, except for his ragged breathing and the clink of metal buttons on the floor. Elise met us at the hatch. One look at his twisted leg was enough. The break was bad. Tibia, maybe fibula too, but the skin wasn't broken. She went into nurse mode instantly, wrapping it and splinting it with scrap wood and tape, her hands steady while she worked. We had some painkillers from the first aid kit that dulled the worst of it, but he was off his feet for weeks. Ground runs fell entirely to me and Elise after that. We shrank the list to absolute essentials and picked the closest targets. No more nice-to-have items, only food, fuel, and something to burn. Each trip meant leaving half our safety behind and trusting the other half to wait for us in a metal box on a shaking tower. Every time the elevator doors opened at ground level, the same heavy thought sat in the back of my head. The tower and the box only kept us alive if we could keep feeding them. Wood for the hungry stove, diesel for the generator, food for the shelves. The winter would not negotiate with us. Our only leverage was how careful we were in the deadly space between the hatch and the fence. The cold was the first problem that felt genuinely personal, like an adversary that knew where we lived. Hunger stayed locked in the inventory notebook and on the supply shelf. Fear lived mostly out on the ground with the shuffling shapes in the snow. But the cold was there every single second, pushing in through microscopic seams and steel bolts. Even with the barrel stove running hot, the air near the floor bit at any exposed skin, and the bunks bolted against the outer walls were always the last to feel warm. We had built the box fast to beat the weather. Now the weather was here, and it took pleasure in showing us exactly where we had rushed. Wind pushed through hairline gaps around the panel seams we hadn't sealed perfectly. Frost bloomed inside along the lower corners like white mold. On the worst nights, the underside of the steel hatch grew a thick skin of ice that cracked loudly when we lifted the bar in the morning. One evening after a brutal wood run, when my hands were still numb inside my heavy gloves, I sat on the floor with my back against a water drum and said, If we keep burning fuel this hard just to keep the walls from freezing, we are going to run out of wood before the lake thaws. Elise sat across from me, rubbing her chafed fingers, and answered, "Then we stop trying to heat the whole county. We make the heat we already have stay longer instead of feeding the stove like it has a hole in the bottom." Tessa listened from her bunk, her blanket pulled up to her nose, saying nothing, but her eyes tracked every word. We treated the box like another piece of failing equipment and wrote a new maintenance checklist just for it. Tower integrity came first every morning. Legs, braces, ice buildup, bolts. After that, if the wind allowed it, we hunted the complex for anything that could act as insulation. We found rolls of pink fiberglass from an unfinished office wing, rigid foam sheets from shipping crates, and stacks of heavy moving blankets in a cage by the loading dock. Inside the box, we worked from the floor up. We cut the foam sheets to fit tightly between the vertical steel tubes and taped them in place with duct tape. Then we hung the moving blankets and tarps over them, fastening them with self-tapping screws and washers. It turned the walls into a patchwork quilt of dull gray and blue, but the metal stopped fogging with frost almost immediately. The ceiling got the same treatment. On a calm day, we let the fire burn down, stood on the bunks to reach the high spots, and pushed fiberglass into every gap we could find. When the stove had been running again for an hour, the difference was clear. The heat stayed close and heavy instead of racing straight out through the roof. We changed how we lived in the space, too. At first, each of us held to a corner to feel less crowded. After we saw how much easier it was to keep one spot warm than four, we pulled the bedding in. Tessa's bunk stayed sandwiched between ours at night to share body heat. Elliot stuck off his feet with the bad leg, took the spot across from the stove so he could watch the fire and handle small jobs with his hands when he couldn't sleep. The stove schedule tightened into a science. Instead of feeding it whenever it looked low, we set rough times on the back of a food list. Bigger burns in the morning and evening when we were moving around, smaller maintenance burns during the day, and then a careful dense pack before we tried to sleep. We learned which scraps burned hot and fast like crate wood, and which pieces of heavy pallet oak held coals for hours. One long board, cut just right and laid on a good bed of glowing embers, could carry the box from midnight to first light if we left it alone. The generator fell into that rhythm. We stopped thinking of it as an emergency backup and treated it like a tool for specific jobs. An hour in the early evening charged the battery bank, spun a small circulation fan that pushed warm air down from the ceiling, and fed a compact ceramic heater. We pointed at the coldest corner while we cooked. The hum became a short, predictable part of the day instead of a random shock in the dark. Enclosed heat comes with its own invisible hazards. Every time we ran the generator or pushed the stove hard, one of us checked the vents and watched the small carbon monoxide detector taped by the hatch. Once a day, even when it felt like a punishment, we cracked the slit windows and let the air turn over while we watched our breath drift out and fresh, biting cold slide in. 10 minutes of discomfort was cheaper than getting dizzy and never waking up. The first night it truly felt different came a few weeks into that new routine. Another storm moved in off the lake, not as violent as the first, but strong enough to rock the tower and rattle the panels. We had just finished the evening burn. The stove ticked as the steel settled. The LED lantern on the shelf cast a low, warm, even light instead of a thin blue one. For the first time since we moved up, our breath did not billow in heavy clouds with every sentence. Small comforts started to matter more than big victories. We kept one heavy ceramic mug aside as the warm mug, filled it with hot water, and passed it to whoever's hands were shaking from a shift outside. We heated smooth rocks by the stove and wrapped them in cloth to tuck at Tessa's feet before she slept. Elise found a crate of old paperbacks in a storage closet and carried them up. Reading out loud for 20 minutes at night did more for our heads than anything else we had tried. On clear days when the sky over the lake was blindingly bright and the wind stayed low, sunlight came through the small windows and warmed any surface it hit. We shifted our seats to chase those patches of natural heat. On those days, the stove burned smaller, and we opened the slit wider to let the room air out without losing everything we had gained. Between the hard days, the box turned into more than just a shell we had thrown together in a hurry. It held our routines and the few things that still felt normal. Tessa's crayon drawings taped over ugly seams in the insulation. Elise's neat rows of jars and cans. Elliot's pencil notes about fuel and wood beside the hatch. My own scribbles about tower checks. Winter outside the panels was still ready to punish any mistake, but inside for a few hours at a time we could sit close to the stove and feel something that was more than just bare survival. By the time the back of the winter finally broke, the tower felt less like a desperate shelter and more like the only normal thing left in the world. The lake stayed mostly frozen, a vast sheet of white and gray, but the heavy drifts around the launch pad began to sag, turning heavy and gray as they pulled back from the equipment doors. We never said the danger was over. That would have been a lie. The infected still moved down below, slower now after months of freezing, but certainly not harmless. From the viewing slit, we saw no steady traffic on the highway. No lines at the gas stations and no electric lights that stayed on all night in the distance. What changed first wasn't the world, it was us. The sharp, jagged panic that had filled every quiet minute during the early weeks calcified into a hard, plain routine. The box stayed warm enough most days. We knew exactly how much food sat behind each handwritten label, and exactly how many hours of heat were left in each wood stack. One morning I woke up before the stove even creaked and just lay there listening. The wind outside sounded smaller, less angry. When I opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder, the air met me with a sharp, wet bite instead of a full, numbing hit. Standing on the mid-platform, I looked over the complex. The snow still covered most of it, but for the first time in months I could see the black lines of fencing and the asphalt roads cutting through the white landscape like scars. We talked about what came next in pieces, usually over dinner. At first, the only plan had been to get through the cold season without falling, freezing, or starving to death. Now, the questions shifted. Elise looked up from her bowl one evening and asked, "If we make it to full spring, do we go down and try to live on the ground again, or do we stay up here as long as we can?" I thought about it and said, "If we leave this box, we do it because we are walking towards something better, not just because we are tired of climbing ladders." Elliot, leaning against the wall with his healing leg stretched out, added, "If more people survived in town than we think, they will be looking for high spots and strong walls too. We already have one." We tested the edges of our safety instead of making big moves. On mild days, we stayed outside the box longer, standing on the open platform with our faces turned into the sun, watching the yard and the pine trees beyond the fence line. On our ground runs, we checked one extra building or walked a little farther along the access road before turning back, reclaiming our territory inch by inch. Tessa changed the fastest, and that was the hardest thing to watch. When we first came up here, she talked about her friends, the neighbors, and the school playground. By late winter, her world had narrowed down to the box, the tower structure, the shapes in the snow, and the stories we told at night. One evening, she sat by the slit window watching the sun drop behind the trees and asked, "If we live in a real house again, will the walls feel wrong because they do not move?" I looked at her and answered, "Maybe at first. But walls are not safe because they move or stay still, Tess. They are safe because of what you do behind them." She thought about that for a long minute and said, "Then wherever we go next, I want a stove like this one and hooks in the right places for the door." Elise laughed once, a short, dry sound, and said, "That sounds like a solid plan to me." The fuel in the big tanks kept sliding down, a slow countdown we couldn't stop. When the site manager started marking the levels on the side of the tank in red paint, we tightened our consumption pattern again. The generator schedule shrank to a short 30-minute block in the evening, just enough to charge the essential batteries. We saved the last strong wood burns for nights when the frost crawled back along the ceiling seams or when one of us was feeling sick. The food menu got even simpler. Rice, beans, and the very last of the canned greens carried us through the late days. Spring did not arrive in one clean, cinematic break. It came as a set of small, messy changes. The snow line pulled back from the base of the tower, revealing trash and tools we had dropped months ago. Meltwater puddled on the concrete and then sank into the ground instead of turning to sheet ice each night. The smell of the air changed from metallic ozone to something heavier. Wet earth, rotting leaves, and the thaw. Birds came back one morning loud and chaotic in the trees beyond the fence, and their noise covered ours in a way that helped more than any conversation. We never sat down and formally voted to keep the box as our permanent home, but that is what we chose. The tower still stood. The box still kept us warm and off the dangerous ground. The town still looked like a place where one bad corner could end everything we had built in a second. Until the balance tipped some other way, height beats distance every time. In the end, what kept us alive on that tower wasn't a single clever trick or a specific piece of gear. It was a short set of rules we followed religiously, even when we were dead tired or afraid. Live higher than the worst trouble can easily reach. Keep your noise and your heat signature smaller than the weather whenever you can. Fix what breaks while it is still a small problem, because big problems kill you. Move in pairs on the ground and never ever rush a job just because you want it to be tomorrow already. When I look back at the fall now, it feels like we stepped through a narrow gate. One week I was a maintenance tech tightening bolts for commercial launches that would never happen. The next I was counting cans of beans, watching my daughter sleep against a shaking steel wall, and calling that motion normal. The tower didn't change, it's just steel. We did. Up here, survival hasn't been about action movie heroics. It has been about writing things down, checking them twice, and admitting what we don't know yet. It has been about listening when the steel under our feet tells us that a brace is tired, or a leg is carrying more ice than it should. It has been about choosing to climb one more flight of stairs when the easy choice would be to stay on the ground and hope somebody else makes good decisions for you. I don't know how long we will stay on this tower. I don't know how many people are left beyond the tree line, or whether anyone is still aiming rockets at the sky from some other coast. I do know that we took a place built to hold a ship and turned it into a home that carried us through a brutal winter without human threats or gunfights in the snow. Just 3 adults and 1 child trying to stay a little ahead of the cold, the hunger, and the noise. If you made it this far into the story, thanks for spending the time with us on the tower. If you like the build and the survival logs, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what kind of story you want to hear next. Until then, stay warm, stay careful, and try to keep something solid under your feet when the world starts to move.